He raised her like a sister until she became his wife. The first time Elijah laid eyes on the 2-year-old girl abandoned at the gate of their dusty compound, he didn't feel anything close to love. There was only curiosity, a strange, gnawing interest in the tiny creature wrapped in a faded blue towel, crying with a desperation that somehow pierced through the cacophony of life in their rural Nigerian village. Elijah was 15 at the time and already more man than boy, helping his widowed mother run the family's cassava and poultry farm. Life had taught him not to expect miracles. People left, people died. Hunger didn't forgive, and dreams didn't grow in dry soil. But that day, as he watched his mother cradle the crying child with trembling arms and whisper prayers into her ear, something shifted, something he wouldn't understand for decades. The village was abuzz with rumours. Some said the child was a product of incest, a shameful secret cast away in the dead of night. Others whispered that she was a sacrifice that the gods had rejected. Elijah didn't care for stories. All he knew was that Mama named her Amara, meaning grace, and said she was a gift from God. Elijah thought the name was too gentle for a child who had come into the world so violently, but he didn't argue. You didn't argue with Mama when her voice took on that thunderous calm that made the chickens go still and even the wind pause. Amara was a quiet child, but her silence wasn't empty. It was weighty, watchful. She followed Elijah everywhere. If he was feeding goats, she was there, clumsily holding the feed pan. If he was clearing the chicken coop, she would crouch beside him, mimicking his every move. At night, when the lantern flickered and Mama sang old Igbo lullabies, Amara would curl up beside Elijah on the mat and place her tiny hand on his chest. He never told anyone, but those were the only nights he slept without dreaming of his late father's machete slashing through tall grass, a metaphor his mind had not yet learned to interpret. Over the years, Elijah became her world. He was the one who taught her to write her name with charcoal on old cement bags. He was the one who made her laugh when she lost her front teeth and refused to smile for a week. When village boys mocked her for not having real parents, Elijah was the one who dragged them into the bush and came back bloodied but proud. Their bond was sacred, innocent, fierce. It was the kind of love that grew wild and without permission, like weeds in the cracks of a broken home. But not everyone saw it that way. By the time Elijah turned 27 and Amara was 14, whispers had begun to resurface. The same mouths that had gossiped about her origins now began twisting their faces in suspicion. He's not her real brother, they'd mutter at the market. He's raising her like a sister, but we all know how men are. Some said it softly, like a warning. Others said it with glee, waiting for scandal to erupt like ripe fruit falling from a tree. Elijah heard the whispers, but he shrugged them off. People in the village always needed someone to talk about, and Amara, beautiful, strange, and deeply attached to him, was an easy target. Amara, however, wasn't deaf to it either. At 15, she had grown into a striking young woman with piercing eyes that seemed to hold the weight of secrets even she didn't understand. She wasn't naive. The world had always been harsh to her, and she had learned early on that she had to guard her heart with claws. But around Elijah, she was soft, vulnerable, curious. She had once asked him why he never got married. Elijah had laughed and said he didn't have time for women. "I already have a handful with you and Mama," he had joked. She had smiled, but there had been a flicker in her eyes, a question left unspoken. That flicker would soon become a fire. The first undeniable change happened on a rainy Thursday. Amara had just turned 16. The rain had poured for hours, turning the red earth into thick mud. Their small house, built from mud bricks and tin, was no match for the storm, and one of the windows had shattered. Elijah spent hours fixing it while Amara dried the floor. When the work was done, soaked and exhausted, they sat near the fireplace in silence, listening to the crackle of wood. She leaned her head on his shoulder, something she had done hundreds of times before. But this time Elijah tensed. Her skin was warm, her breath too close, her silence too loud. He moved away gently, pretending to stoke the fire. That night he couldn't sleep. He told himself it was guilt, that the thought that crossed his mind, just a flicker, a what if, a forbidden whisper, was a betrayal. He prayed harder than he ever had. He avoided her eyes for days. But Amara noticed. She always noticed. Weeks passed. Months. The tension between them thickened like unspoken truths hanging in the air. Elijah would catch her staring at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She would linger when their hands touched. She began dressing differently, more deliberately, more woman than girl. Mama noticed none of this. She was getting older, her eyesight failing, and she spent most of her time in prayer or rest. But the village noticed, and the whispers grew louder. The real fracture happened the night Amara had a nightmare and came running into Elijah's room. It wasn't unusual. She had been doing it since she was a child, but this time she was 17, and when she clung to him, her body shaking with fear, Elijah's arms wrapped around her instinctively. Their eyes met in the dim lantern light. The silence between them stretched until it broke. He kissed her. It was a mistake. He knew it even as it happened, a terrible, glorious, unforgivable mistake. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into it, tentative, trembling, and wholly present. When he realized what he had done, he pushed her away, his face contorted with horror. "Go," he whispered. "Go to your room." She obeyed, but not before looking at him one last time with eyes that seemed to say, "Now you know too." Elijah didn't leave his room for a whole day. He skipped the morning feeding, ignored Mama's knock at his door, and left his food untouched on the wooden stool. He lay on the mat, staring at the rust-coloured ceiling, listening to the rain beat softly on the tin roof, trying to pray but failing. The words wouldn't come. He opened his Bible, but the pages blurred. He wanted the kiss erased, forgotten, reversed. But it had already happened, and worse, it had awoken something in him, something old and buried, something shameful and yearning. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was desire. And that terrified him more than the judgment of the village or the wrath of God. That night, Elijah emerged from his room with a resolution forged in fire. He would send her away, not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her too much. He would find a boarding school in the city, somewhere far, somewhere she could start over, somewhere he wouldn't see the way she looked at him with questions in her eyes and forgiveness on her lips, He would explain it to Mama as for her future. And he would work longer hours, sell more poultry, take more risks. Anything to keep her safe, from him, from the world, from the storm gathering inside their home. But Amara didn't go quietly. When he told her, she didn't cry, she didn't plead. She only stared at him with that same unshakable stillness that made him feel like a boy again, 15, broken, standing over her cradle. "You think sending me away will fix you," she said, her voice soft and even. "But you're not broken because of me, Elijah. You were broken long before I came." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him with nothing but silence and shame. The next week was the worst of Elijah's life. Amara didn't speak to him. She didn't follow him around. She didn't linger. It was as if she had disappeared into herself. Elijah thought that would make things easier, but it only made them worse. He missed her laughter, her quiet humming while she cleaned, her snarky comments about his cooking. He realized too late that she wasn't just the girl he raised. She was the rhythm of his home. Without her, everything was offbeat. Mama, sensing the tension but blind to its cause, began to ask questions. "Did you two fight?" she asked one night over dinner. "You're like strangers in this house." Elijah shrugged. "She's growing up, Mama. Girls change." Mama laughed, that deep belly laugh that always seemed to command peace. "Ah, Elijah, you speak as if you know anything about girls. That one has always been different. She's not like the others. Her heart is old, wiser than her years. And maybe that was the problem. Amara had never truly been a child, not the way others were. Life had forced her to grow in the shadow of grief, abandonment, and whispers. Elijah had tried to shield her from it all, but he now saw that he had failed. Not because he hadn't tried, but because he had never fully understood the weight of what she carried. The day Amara left for boarding school, the sky was clear, almost offensively bright. Mama cried as she handed her a small bag of snacks and a well-worn Bible. Elijah stood behind them, his face a mask. Amara didn't hug him goodbye. She didn't say a word. She only climbed into the back of the bus that would take her to the city and stared straight ahead until they turned the bend. He didn't cry. But something in him broke. Months passed, then a year. Letters came occasionally from her, from the school, but they were always addressed to Mama. Amara never wrote directly to Elijah, and he never replied. He busied himself with work, expanding the poultry pen, hiring 2 young boys from the village to help, and even investing in a small hatchery project. Business improved. People praised his discipline, his ambition, but none of it filled the hollow that sat in his chest like a stone. Mama began falling ill more frequently. The doctors in town couldn't find anything specific. Old age, they said. Too much stress. Elijah tried everything: herbal remedies, fasting prayers, even consulting a traveling prophet. Nothing worked. The light in her eyes dimmed slowly, like a candle that knew its time was ending. One night, 2 years after Amara had left, Mama called Elijah into her room. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Promise me something," she said, her eyes glassy and distant. "Promise me you'll take care of her, not like a sister, not like a child. Take care of her like you were meant to." Elijah froze. "What do you mean, Mama?" Mama smiled weakly. "You'll understand, one day." Then she closed her eyes and drifted into a sleep she never woke up from. The funeral was small but heavy. Amara returned for it, now 19 and breathtaking. She wore a simple black wrapper and a red headscarf, her face calm but unreadable. Elijah hadn't seen her in 2 years, but it felt like 10. She didn't cry when Mama was buried, but as the final handful of dirt hit the coffin, she whispered something under her breath. Something only Elijah heard. "Now it's just us." That night she came to his room again, not with fear this time, not with dreams, but with clarity. "Elijah," she said, standing in the doorway, "we can't keep pretending, not anymore." He looked at her, his heart thundering in his chest. "We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do. Mama knew. She always knew. You raised me because you had to. But I loved you long before I understood what it meant to love a man, and I know you love me too." He stood, anger flaring at her, at himself, at the world. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she said, stepping closer. "You're not my blood, you're not my brother, you're the man I've loved all my life." He stepped back. "It's wrong." "Is it?" she asked. "Or is it just that it doesn't fit into the box you were taught to live in?" He had no answer. She reached for his hand. "We've spent our lives surviving what others gave us: shame, judgment, silence. I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live with you." Air between them vibrated with truth and terror. Elijah looked into her eyes and saw everything he had tried to bury: love, pain, longing. He thought of the years, the sacrifices, the nights. He thought of Mama's last words, of the world outside their walls. And for the first time in his life, he made a choice, not based on fear, but on fire. He pulled her into his arms. The weeks after Mama's burial unfolded like a dream Elijah feared waking from. Amara stayed in the house, no longer a visitor, but not exactly the child who had left 2 years before either. They slipped into a new rhythm, one filled with silent touches and long stares, gentle domesticity shadowed by a thunderstorm of guilt and pleasure. It was as if their entire home had shifted its foundation to accommodate a love they both knew shouldn't exist, but could no longer be denied. They kept their union hidden. In the daylight, Elijah still called her my sister to the neighbours and wore his stoic mask as he walked through the market square or sold eggs to buyers. At night, she became his softness, his undoing. They didn't talk about what it all meant. There were no declarations, no vows, just stolen moments in the silence, heavy with the knowledge that their truth was a ticking bomb. The village, however, had ears and eyes. Suspicion began to crawl back into the community like smoke through the cracks. Old women at the well would cluck their tongues when Amara walked past, her hips swaying beneath the vibrant Ankara wrappers. Young men watched her with hunger, but with caution. Everyone knew she belonged to Elijah in a way that wasn't brotherly. And the pastors, the youth leaders, the village head's wife? Their stares turned colder with each passing Sunday. The whispers gained form. Elijah never married, and that girl's been under his roof since she was a baby. I always said it was strange how close they were. You raise a girl like your child, then take her as a wife, it's witchcraft. Disgusting. Abomination. Even if there's no blood, he raised her like his own. Elijah heard it all, every venomous word, and still he could not let go. He tried. He told himself it had to end. He started sleeping in Mama's old room. He avoided Amara's gaze, took on more work, hired a second farmhand, and even began attending prayer meetings in the evenings. But love Real love, twisted and raw and maddening, does not obey logic, and neither did Amara. One night, after nearly 2 weeks of self-imposed exile, Elijah returned to his room to find her sitting on his bed, waiting. She wore Mama's old wrapper around her waist, her shoulders bare, her hair braided down her back. "I can't do this without you," she said simply. No tears, no drama. He closed the door and stood there, torn in 1,000 pieces. "You deserve a life without shame," he whispered. "So do you," she replied. He sat beside her, their arms touching, their breaths synchronized like a shared heartbeat. "If we marry," he said slowly, "the village will never forgive us." "Then we don't ask for their forgiveness," she said. "We ask for each other's." There was a silence, not the heavy, fearful kind that used to hang between them, but a sacred one, a peace carved out of war. That was the night Elijah decided he would marry her, not in secret, not in whispers, but openly, boldly against the entire world if necessary. Elijah's decision to marry Amara wasn't born of lust or rebellion. It was the result of a war he had waged within himself for years, a battle between expectation and emotion. He had tried to suppress it, to bury it beneath duty and religion, to pretend that what pulsed in his chest was anything but love. But in the quiet aftermath of Mama's passing, the walls he had built to contain the truth collapsed, and what stood unshaken in the rubble was his love for her. Not paternal, not brotherly, but something deeper, adult, intimate, unapologetically real. And so he made a choice, a conscious, painful, liberating choice. He would no longer run. The first person he told was Pastor Jonah, the man who had mentored him since boyhood. They met under the mango tree behind the old stone church where Elijah had once been baptized, scolded, molded, the same place he had gone to confess boyhood sins and receive manhood lectures. Now, he returned with a confession that would test every bond he had ever known. "I want to marry Amara," he said, his voice low but unshaken. Pastor Jonah's reaction was immediate. He sat upright, his mouth falling slightly open before closing again, tight as a sealed gate. When the words truly settled into meaning, he choked on his tea and stood abruptly, glaring. "Elijah," he said, trembling with restrained fury, "that girl is your sister in every way but blood." "She's not," Elijah replied. "Not legally, not biologically. I never adopted her. I raised her, yes. We were family, but not by law. And she's a woman now. She's no longer a child." "You think that excuses this madness?" the pastor snapped. "You changed her diapers. Diapers. She learned to speak her first words in your presence. You taught her to ride a bicycle, boy. How can you look at her and, God forbid, want her in your bed?" Elijah flinched, but not from shame, from exhaustion. "Because love doesn't follow rules, sir. It doesn't care how we met or when. It grew quietly, painfully. And now it's here, undeniable. I've tried to ignore it, suppress it, destroy it, but it stayed." "You've been deceived," Jonah growled. "You're not in love. You're sick." "I'm not," Elijah said. "I know the difference." The old man shook his head, heartbroken and disgusted. "The village will burn you for this. The church will strip you of every ounce of respect. You will lose everything, your farm, your name, your place here." "I know," Elijah said, "but I've already lost myself trying to please them." The silence that followed was deafening. Pastor Jonah's final words came in a whisper, but they struck like thunder. "You will never have my blessing, nor God's." And with that, he walked away, sandals crunching across the dirt like the final nails in a coffin. Elijah returned home, weary but relieved. He had told the truth. No more hiding. He expected the backlash, but he underestimated its swiftness and savagery. At first it was subtle. The feed supplier stopped returning his messages. The market women who once smiled and called him Odogwu farmer now turned their backs. Parents pulled their children away when he passed. Even the young apprentices on his farm began to distance themselves, until one morning they simply didn't show up at all. And then, the wall. One early morning, just before sunrise, Elijah stepped out to feed the chickens and found a word scrawled across the front wall of his compound in thick black charcoal. Abomination! Smashed eggs lay at the base of the wall, dripping yellow and white down the concrete, blending into the message like spit into poison. The insult wasn't just written, it was hurled literal and symbolic. He stood there for a long time, staring at the word, reading it over and over again as if it would eventually change meaning. But it didn't. Amara joined him moments later. She said nothing at first, just looked at the wall, at the dripping yolk, and then at him. "What now?" she asked. "We wash it off," Elijah answered. And they did, together. With buckets and brushes, they scrubbed away the hate written in soot and egg. But as the wall slowly became clean again, they both knew the real stain, the one burned into their reputations, would not wash away so easily. The hate escalated quickly. Business dried up. The villagers stopped buying from Elijah's farm altogether. The feed supply was cut off. Men who once asked him for help in poultry ventures no longer acknowledged his presence. Church members avoided his gaze. And then came the threats. One night a rock crashed through the front window. Amara screamed. Elijah ran to the source and found a crude note tied to the stone. "Leave or burn." He stayed up all night with his hunting knife in hand, seated near the front door. Amara stayed beside him. They didn't sleep, they didn't speak. She simply laid her head on his shoulder and held his hand, and together they listened to the night as if waiting for war. The next morning, he looked at her with the clarity of a man who had been stripped of every illusion. "I want to marry you," he said. Not in secret, not with shame, boldly, publicly. Amara blinked, her eyes glistening, not with fear, but with fierce certainty. "I thought you'd never say it out loud." He didn't have a ring, but he had something more precious, his late mother's baptism wrapper, passed down from a woman who had taught him how to love and serve. He wrapped it gently around Amara's waist like a sacred offering. "This is all I have," he said, "but it's everything I am." Amara kissed him long and deep and whispered, "Yes." 1,000 times yes. They decided to wed beneath the mango tree, the very same place where judgment had once tried to crush Elijah's truth. There would be no pastor, no choir, no crowd to celebrate them, no witness to offer a prayer, but they had each other. They had the wind in the trees, the warmth of the morning sun, and the memories of the life they had built. Brick by brick, seed by seed, love by love. Amara wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself. Around her waist the wrapper, now sacred cloth. Elijah wore his cleanest shirt, freshly pressed, and the same rugged shoes he'd worn to his mother's funeral. They held hands under the canopy of mango branches, the sunlight streaking through leaves like heaven cracking open to listen. "I choose you," Elijah said, his voice shaking only slightly, "even when the world says I shouldn't, even when it hurts, even when it costs me everything." "I choose you," Amara replied, her voice full of fire, "even when they call me cursed, even when they call us wrong. You are my beginning, and you'll be my end." They kissed, not as fugitives or rebels might, but as two people who had clawed their way to truth through hell and shame. That night they shared a bed no longer weighed down by guilt, not because the world had accepted them, but because they had accepted each other. Fully, finally. Outside, the village remained cold. The stares didn't stop, the whispers didn't fade, the insults still lingered in the air like smoke from an old fire. But inside that home, inside that battered, boycotted farm, a man and a woman slept in peace for the first time in their lives. They had chosen love over law, soul over structure, heart over heritage, and nothing would ever be the same again.